Donald Trump said actually Osama bin Laden wasn't that bad. 2 weeks before the 20th anniversary of 9/11, Trump is out there claiming bin Laden only did one terrorist attack and he wasn't a monster. As we approach the 20th year anniversary of 9/11, Donald Trump has been doing the rounds with conservative media outlets to talk about terrorism. One of his new takes, that Osama bin Laden, best known as the architect of the September 11th attacks, wasn't actually as bad as everyone makes him out to be. Welcome to the USA One podcast, the programs where I and my two sidekicks share the most interesting notes of the day from social media, radio, newspapers, and other publications that we know you don't have time to follow. I'm Juan Andres, also known as Senor USA, with my two co-hosts, Professor Pico and Dr. Mordidas. If you would like to view our programs, you can find us on the USA One podcast on iHeartRadio, Podbean, TuneIn, Alexa, and YouTube. Easily accessible on your smartphone or any internet-compatible device. Speaking to a conservative radio host on Thursday, the following words actually came out of the ex-president's mouth. We took out the founder of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then, of course, Iranian military leader Qasem Soleimani. Now, just so you understand, Soleimani is bigger by many, many times than Osama bin Laden. The founder of ISIS is bigger by many, 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 many times al-Baghdadi than Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden? He was big. He was the biggest one. He's worse. How can Trump say that? Osama bin Laden had one hit, and it was a bad one in New York City, the World Trade Center. A lot of Hispanics live there. I don't like that. These other guys, two guys, were monsters. They were monsters. And he says, I kept saying for years, why aren't they getting them? For years I said, I got them. The press doesn't talk about it. They don't talk about it because they don't want to talk about it. There's a lot to unpack here, but we should probably start with the fact that while Trump is trying to claim that bin Laden was some kind of one-hit wonder for terrorist attacks, the reality is that he was actually also linked to the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings that killed more than 200 people, and the 2000 year bombing of the USS Cole, which killed 17 U.S. Navy sailors. Then there's the bizarre way he talks about 9/11, where you can tell he doesn't really want to admit its magnitude because that would somehow undermine his argument. So he begrudgingly calls it a bad one. And of course, there's the assertion that al-Baghdadi and Soleimani were monsters, but bin Laden, the man responsible for the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history, that killed people, Latinos. I don't like it, not so much. Which may be news to the families of the 2,977 victims that died that day. Thank you, Doctor. Look, meanwhile, the sickest part here, aside from trying to claim bin Laden gets a bad rap, is that Trump is undoubtedly saying that all this because Barack Obama oversaw the operation that killed bin Laden. And he's pathologically jealous of the guy. And then there's the issue that Barack Obama, his skin color. And that makes it worse because it destroys his white nationalist mentality. How can a thin black man achieve more than a fat white man? Stop to think of it. Also because he needs people to pat him on the head and tell him he did a great job, and it kills him that supposedly the press doesn't talk about it. Anyway, the world can't wait to hear his remarks on the anniversary of 9/11. I'm sure they're going to be a doozy. Don't forget to blame Trump administration bigot Stephen Miller for the debacle in Afghanistan. While the world-renowned carnival barker was out there talking about Afghanistan, it's important to remember that a considerable amount of what's going on in Afghanistan is also Stephen Miller's fault, his aide, as the United States leaves tens of thousands of Afghans behind who helped 2 decades of military and diplomatic efforts there to the mercies of the Taliban. A single person may deserve more credit than any other. Top Trump White House aide and immigration foe Stephen Miller. Miller, who worked for all 4 years as former President Donald Trump's immigration advisor, pushing restrictive policies, was instrumental in slowing down the processes of special immigration visas. SIVs, they're called, special immigration visas, for Afghan interpreters, embassy staff, and others who were now top targets for Taliban assassinations. According to both refugee advocates and those who have worked there, it's horrible. Yes, it is horrible. And the seeds of the insanity that we're seeing right now were planted in Stephen Miller's brain, said a former Army officer who served in Afghanistan and co-founded the group No One Left Behind, adding that Miller is as much to blame for the deaths of interpreters and others as the Taliban themselves. He's complicit in their murders. He's brilliant at how evil he is. A former White House employee who worked for former Vice President Mike Pence said Miller had a knack for using the bureaucracy to affect his agenda. He does it in a crafty way. You can trace the steps of everything he did along the way. She said, describing how Miller was even able to use COVID-19, the pandemic, to slow down the processing of the special immigration visa applications. This was just another opportunity to push his anti-immigration agenda. Miller became the top advisor to candidate Trump in 2016, then moved to the White House when Trump took office in 2017. With Trump's encouragement and support, he began implementing anti-immigration policies across the executive agencies, including a slowdown of the SIV program. A State Department Inspector General's report in June of 2020, for example, found that Afghan visa programs suffered from processing times on average more than twice the 9 months that Congress had demanded back in 2013. So now, instead of taking 9 months, they were taking more than 18 months. So they were processing half the people, or less. It blamed in part the failure of the Trump administration to appoint a senior coordinating official for the SIVs, the special immigration visas, which Congress had also mandated, as well as the bureaucratic hurdle of requiring the human resources employer letter that they needed as well. As a result, I'm Dr. Martinez. The stage to determine chief of mission approval is a bottleneck in the Afghan SIV program. The report stated as of December 29, 2019, that 8,444 of the 18,695 applicants, 45%, were waiting for a chief of mission decision. Spencer Sullivan, a former Army cavalry officer, told a media outlet he could not understand the purpose of requiring such letters if a military service member's recommendation already existed, but he ventured an idea. My guess is that's in line with Stephen Miller's policy of keeping brown people out of the country. I don't like that. I don't like Miller. I don't like Miller. Recently, Miller has claimed that the U.S. should not be bringing Afghans to U.S. because they might be terrorists, and also because it costs too much money. It's extraordinarily expensive to resettle a refugee in the United States. They get a free health care, they get a free education, they get free housing, they get free food, they get cash welfare. He said that to Fox News last week. If the United States takes the policy that every person suffering under Sharia law, he said as well, that they have a right to come to the United States of America, we're going to make room for 500 million people. I don't like this man. I understand, Doctor, calm down. And then, of course, there's the handiwork of Miller's former boss, which conservatives are demanding Biden's resignation conveniently fail to remember that in Afghanistan, President Biden got dealt yet another losing hand from the Trump administration. Their DOHA agreement, and remember that name, DOHA agreement, because he was talking about it like it was the end of the world, and it was nothing but a bunch of junk, and I'm telling you why it was junk right now. Okay, all this mess falls squarely on the lap of the one-time, twice impeached failure of a president. The Doha agreement with the Taliban violated the most basic principles of self-government for the Afghan people. There was no way to enforce it or make sure the Taliban kept its word. There was no denunciation of al-Qaeda terrorists, and worst of all, the deal didn't mandate that the Taliban stop attacks against Afghan security forces. Trump's deal with the Taliban was flawed from the start, which is why Trump's own officials are now scrambling to distance themselves from this silly agreement that he was so proud of, and it's now a disgrace to the country because he's the one that caused all this problem that we faced when we were evacuating people. To have our generals say that they're depending on diplomacy with the Taliban is an unbelievable scenario. Negotiating with the Taliban is like dealing with the devil, tweeted Trump's ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who certainly voiced no such objections while working for Trump. She was not alone. Our Secretary of State signed a surrender agreement with the Taliban. Trump's former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, told journalists, this collapse goes back to the capitulation agreement of 2020. The Taliban didn't defeat us, we defeated ourselves. Could you believe that? Even Mike Pompeo, Trump's Secretary of State and the man who negotiated the deal with the Taliban in the first place, is denouncing it now. He had the audacity to tell Fox News that the debacle in Afghanistan will certainly harm America's credibility and its friends and allies when he was the one that signed it. He certainly didn't seem to think so while he was laying the groundwork for the debacle in the first place. We're letting the Taliban run free and wild all around Afghanistan, moaned Pompeo in that same interview, strangely failing to mention that he was the guy who cut the deal to release the Taliban's leader from prison in the first place. And that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is the fact that Trump agreed to a deal to release 5,000 Taliban fighters from the jails. If they would have been in the jails while we were evacuating, stop to think of it. But then what do you expect from a man that incited an insurrection against his own country? Could you believe that? And that in itself is bad enough, but to have 100 million Americans aiding and abetting him so he can get back in the White House, the man who lied to us about making America first, that he was gonna, everything he did was America first, and then he turned around and attacked the America that he said he wanted to make first? Does that make any sense to you? America's first and then I attack it? I attack the seed that represents everything about America? The capital? If you would like to view our programs, you can find us on the USA One podcast on iHeartRadio, Podbean, TuneIn, Alexa, and YouTube. And they're all easily accessible on your smartphone or any internet-compatible device. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.